Hi, class. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at problem 18-2B. So if you'll hold on just a minute, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Okay, just a second while I pull this up. Okay, let me adjust my screen a little bit so I can see what I'm doing. Alrighty. We're going to be doing problem 18-2B. And what we're going to be doing is classifying cost. And we want to classify each of the following costs as either a product cost or a period cost. And we also want to indicate whether each of these is a direct materials cost, a direct labor cost, or a factory overhead cost. And so this is a list of costs that are going to be incurred by several businesses. The salary of a quality control supervisor. We need to classify this as a cost first. What I would suggest you do is decide whether that would be a product cost or whether it would be a period cost. The definition of product cost is any materials that are going to go into the manufacture of the product, such as direct materials or indirect materials, are considered to be product cost. You also have labor, direct labor, and indirect labor that are also considered to be product cost. All of your other factory overhead costs are going to be your product cost. Your period costs are just your selling and your administrative expenses. Once we have the cost classified as product or period cost, then we're going to subclassify it as whether it should be a direct materials cost, which is a major part of the cost of manufacturing a product. It's an integral part of the cost of the manufacture of a product. It is materials that would go directly into the physical product itself. And we're going to have to classify these costs as whether they are direct materials cost or whether they will be direct labor cost. And direct labor would result from employees that are actually working on the product itself to produce the product, or whether it could be a factory overhead cost. Now, your factory overhead costs can be your indirect materials, your indirect labor, and any other factory cost that you might incur. So when we talk about the salary of a quality control supervisor, when I think of quality control supervisors, I think of someone that's on the line and they are supervising the actual manufacture of the product itself. They're making sure that the product is as it should be. And so when we talk about being on the line, I automatically think of them being as a part of our product cost, because product costs are your factory cost. But I would also want to classify this by the fact that even though the quality control supervisor might be considered to be a supervisor that is looking at the manufacture of the product on the line, then the quality control supervisor really doesn't have anything to do with the manufacture of the product itself. They're just looking at it to see that the product was manufactured correctly. So the way I would classify this is it's definitely a product cost because it's a part of factory overhead. Direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead are all product cost. I would consider this as a part of factory overhead cost because I would consider the quality control supervisor a part of the indirect labor. Indirect labor is the people whom we are paying that don't really actually have a hands-on effect in the manufacturing process. So I would classify this as a product cost, and I would also classify it as factory overhead. So you're going to choose the best answer here. And I'll just check my work as we go so you can see how we would do that for this class. So anytime you want to check your work, feel free to do so. There's a button down here where you can click on that to check your work in Cengage. Packing supplies for products sold. These supplies are a very small portion of the total cost of the product. All right, so supplies could be either a direct materials cost or an indirect materials cost. Because these supplies have a very small portion of the total cost of the product, they will be considered to be indirect materials. And indirect materials are a part of the factory overhead cost. Your factory overhead cost consists of indirect materials, indirect labor, and all factory overhead cost. One of the things that can help us to define an indirect material is the amount that the material cost. And since it's such a very small portion of the total cost, it would make it an indirect material, which is factory overhead. If these packing supplies had been a large cost and as a part of the product itself, then they would have been considered direct materials. But in this case, it's better to classify these as factory overhead costs because they're a very small portion of the total cost, and that makes them indirect materials. So factory overhead is a part of product cost. So this is going to be product cost, factory overhead cost. That's the best way we can describe this particular cost. Factory operating supplies are also a part of the product cost. Since they relate to the factory, they will be a factory overhead cost. And so factory operating supplies are really indirect cost, materials cost, or their indirect cost, and they would be considered a part of factory overhead. So the best choice here is product cost, and it's factory overhead cost. Depreciation of factory equipment. Depreciation is an expense of the factory equipment. The factory equipment, of course, belongs to the factory. It's a factory overhead cost, and so it will also be a product cost. Remember, product costs are direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. But this depreciation of this factory equipment is best served as a factory overhead cost. So it's a product cost and it's factory overhead cost. All right, in E, it says they're talking about hourly wages of a warehouse laborer. Hourly wages of warehouse laborers. Warehouse laborers really don't put together the product itself. They're not working on the physical product itself. So these would be considered to be indirect labor, but it is a part of factory overhead. So it is going to be a product cost. So the best answer here is product cost, factory overhead. Wages of a company controller secretary. Now, these are wages that we would have to pay to the controller secretary, and these would be considered to be administrative expenses. So they are not really product cost at all. This would be considered a period cost, and it is an administrative expense. The next cost has to do with maintenance and repair costs for factory equipment. Notice they've got the word factory in there, and the majority of the time, if it's got factory in it, it has to do with some type of factory overhead. So factory overhead costs, again, are your indirect materials, your indirect labor, and all other factory costs. This repair cost would be considered an other factory cost. It is a factory overhead cost, and that makes it a product cost. So the answer to this is product cost, factory overhead cost. The next cost has to do with paper that would be used by a commercial printer. If we're a printer, our paper is going to be a part of our direct materials cost. So this is direct materials, and it still would be a product cost. Entertainment expenses for sales representatives. Entertainment expenses are considered selling expenses. So selling expenses are a part of period cost. Your period cost, again, are your administrative expenses and your selling expenses. So this is a selling expense, it's a period cost. Protective glasses for factory machine operators. Again, it's got the word factory in there. So you know it's probably going to be factory overhead. Um, if it's protective glasses, they probably don't cost a lot. It'd probably be like your indirect supplies, or it could be factory supplies that you put this in, but it's definitely factory overhead. And factory overhead is a part of your manufacturing cost. So it's a product cost, and it's a factory overhead cost. Your sales commissions are commissions that you pay to your salespersons, and salespersons is considered to be a selling expense, and so that's a type of uh, period cost. The cost of hogs for a meat processor, that's a direct material for a meat processor, so that's a part of factory overhead, and it's a product cost. Excuse me, it's not factory overhead. It is a direct material, but it is a product cost. The cost of telephone operators for a toll-free hotline to help customers operate products. When we're helping customers operate products, it's a selling type of expense. So this is going to be a period cost, and it's going to be a selling expense. Hard drives for a microcomputer manufacturer. The hard drives will become an integral part of the computer, And so it is a direct material. And if it's a direct material, it's a product cost. Lumber used by a furniture manufacturer. Lumber is also a type of direct materials, and it's a product cost. The wages of machine operators on the production line. Because they're on the production line and they're machine operators, they're working on producing the product itself. This is called direct labor, and it is a product cost. First aid supplies for factory workers. We have the word factory in there, so it's most likely going to be a factory overhead. First aid supplies most likely is going to be some type of factory supply, and it's a factory cost, and so it is also a product cost. Tires for an automobile manufacturer. Tires become a part of the automobile that they're manufacturing, so that is a direct materials and it is a product cost. Paper used by a computer department in processing various managerial reports. Managerial reports would be an administrative type of expense. And so this is going to be a period administrative expense. It's a period cost, in other words. The seed for the grain farmer is a direct materials, and this is part of the product cost. Health insurance premiums paid for factory workers. Your factory workers are considered to be the workers that are working on the product itself. And so this would be considered direct labor. And direct labor is a product cost. Cost of information technology support for corporate headquarters. I would think that would be an administrative expense, and so it's a period cost. Cost for television advertisement, that's a selling expense, and it is a period cost. Executive bonus for vice president of marketing. Marketing usually has something to do with selling, and so I would consider this a period cost, selling cost. And so what we've done today is we've reviewed terms. You need to know what a product cost is. A product cost is a direct materials cost, a direct labor cost, or any factory overhead cost. Your period cost are your selling and your administrative expenses. If it's a factory overhead cost, it can consist or be made up of several factory overhead costs, such as indirect materials, indirect labor, and other factory overhead costs. So that's all I want to talk to you about today. I'm going to stop sharing this with you, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.